We stood out on the church lawn yesterday during our workday, and some of us speculated about the jury's verdict in the Zimmerman trial. I was confident that, though there was not a premeditated murder conviction forthcoming, that there would be a manslaughter conviction, because that just seemed inescapable. A man was, after all, slaughtered. No one in America was more surprised than I was at the announcement last night of a not guilty verdict. What is perhaps more sad is how many African American commentators were on the news who were not surprised, for whom the verdict looked more like business as usual. In 1852, in a speech entitled "The Meaning of the 4th of July for the Negro," freed slave Fredrick Douglass said, "At a time like this, scorching irony, not convincing argument is needed. Oh, had I the ability and could reach the nation's ear, I would today pour out a fiery stream of biting ridicule, blasting reproach, withering sarcasm, and stern rebuke, for it is not light that is needed, but fire. It's not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, the earthquake. The feeling of the nation must be quickened. The conscience of the nation must be roused. The propriety of the nation must be startled. The hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed, and its crimes against God and man must be proclaimed and denounced." It is that quickening of conscience that I'm looking for today. This is not really a time for wit or irony. It's a time for us to expose the hypocrisy of our nation's racial failings. It may be that the facts of the February 2012 shooting death of Trayvon Martin left a jury of 6 Floridians unable to move beyond reasonable doubt. But had the roles been reversed, had a 17-year-old black teenager followed an unarmed white man through a dark neighborhood and in the midst of a confrontation had shot and killed the homeowner, then that young man certainly wouldn't have gone home and slept in his own bed that night after the police had been called, and he would not have come away from the trial with a not guilty conviction or even a manslaughter conviction. Had Trayvon Martin shot George Zimmerman, he would have been lucky to avoid the death penalty. Race was surely an issue in this case, as was class. There's no way to prove it, but I'm personally convinced that had O.J. Simpson not been a famous rich person, he would not have been found not guilty in the murder of his former wife and her friend. Race is a huge factor in our judicial system in America, second only in unfair rulings to the presence of money. It is very uncommon for an impoverished David to ever win in court against an economic Goliath. The jury, charged with the difficult task of rendering a decision in this case, decided that Zimmerman was not guilty, which is a long way from saying that he was innocent. But I would say, in this incident, that Trayvon Martin is dead and that not a single one of us is not guilty. We are all a part of a society that has made it unsafe to walk down the street while being black. There are 30,000 gun deaths in America every year. More than 10,000 of those are homicides, and young black men figure in that number at a disproportionate rate. So there are several thousand young black men gunned down every year in the United States. This one instance has risen to national attention because the circumstances around it seem to perfectly symbolize our American angst. Now, things are better than they used to be, but none of us should pretend that racism is now in the past. Nor should we even be silly about switching from one kind of prejudice to another kind of denial of reality. He's been quoted so often now that he probably regrets having ever said it, but the Reverend Jesse Jackson remarked that nothing makes him more uncomfortable than hearing footsteps behind him on a city street and turning and being relieved when he sees that it's a white person. Crime among angry young black men is not an urban myth, it's real. Of course, poverty causes crime, regardless of race. Bad schools, lack of decent housing, lack of safe neighborhoods, broken down family relationships, addiction, they all cause crime. Crime is not race. And besides, when you take a long view of history, no one has killed more people, enslaved more people, tortured more people, stolen more land than white men. In that sordid historical race, my peeps are undefeated. What we saw in the Zimmerman standoff with Martin was an employed homeowner in a neighborhood with a crime problem and a young black man who just happened to be visiting with his father's girlfriend. Trayvon Martin fit the profile of the kind of person Zimmerman didn't trust, and Zimmerman fit the profile of what made Trayvon Martin angry. If it takes anything to make teenagers angry. The inequality here is that the creepy cracker was able to get a conceal and carry license, and this Sunday morning, he can legally be back out in his neighborhood with a firearm loaded, a round in the chamber, with no safety on, with the gun concealed in a holster in his pants, just like he was last February. Applause for the NRA. We are all aware of this trial because of what it represents, which is about race, and it is about class, and it's even about stage of life. In the dark, in a high-crime neighborhood of Florida, these two met one another, and only one walked away. Now, if I ask you to make a great leap in time backwards 4 or 5 minutes ago, when Patrick read to you the familiar passage from Luke that we know as the parable of the Good Samaritan, most of you have had this story interpreted to you by preachers or Sunday school teachers since before you could take the training wheels off of your bicycle. In spite of how familiar it is to you, I would like to ask you to today picture the scene in your minds again. Only this time I want you to see it as an encounter, not between a Samaritan and a Jew, but as Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman. And really it could go either way. Trayvon is walking back to his father's girlfriend's house with a bottle of tea and a bag of Skittles, talking to a friend on his cell phone, and he sees George Zimmerman lying in the street, robbed, beaten, and half dead. Or you could see it the other way around. Zimmerman is out on his neighborhood watch, looking for some of those, however he typified it, who always get away, and he happens on the hoodie-wearing skinny form of Trayvon lying wounded in the street. Look at it either way, because these are two guys who are not going to like each other in any setting. They've been trained, often by very real and repeated bad experiences, to despise one another. Either one could have found the other one lying in the street and had a very private moment of satisfaction. This time the creepy cracker got it, or this time the thug got it. What I'm asking you to consider about this biblical parable is that the guy we call the Good Samaritan may have found this beaten, half-dead Jew, and even though he stopped, picked him up, took him to get help, and even paid for it out of his pocket, he may very well have still hated the man and everything that he represented. The text didn't say that this was the only Samaritan in the region that happened to be a good guy, that he was somehow magically free of prejudice, or that he had entirely forgiven the Jews for everything that the Jews had done to the Samaritans, which was considerable, or the other way around. The choice that the Samaritan made in this parable was when he was confronted by a person he undoubtedly saw as an enemy, he didn't have to decide about what he thought about Jews. He had to decide who he wanted to be. When George Zimmerman called 911 to report a suspicious-looking person in his neighborhood, it was not the first time he had placed a 911 call to make such a report. And it wasn't the 10th time either, or the 20th. Over the preceding years that Zimmerman had been on the neighborhood watch, he had placed 46 calls to 911, all to report suspicious-looking people walking through his neighborhood. And when the 911 operator asked him to describe the person, every single one of them was a black young man. I'm not saying there's a pattern here. Oh, the hell I'm not. George Zimmerman profiled black young men, and there's a good reason to believe that black young men had perpetrated some of the crime in Zimmerman's neighborhood. It's also true that neighborhood watch volunteers are not supposed to follow suspects or to go out armed. Even if he fired in self-defense, this is not an innocent incident. There were a number of bad decisions that led up to a very sad and very wrong death of Trayvon Martin, but no one here should pretend that there's not someone out there in the world that you're afraid of, someone you distrust at the very sight of them. In the Ozarks, we tend to think that everyone who speaks with a Spanish accent is from Mexico, but I can tell you that they are not. And that in Central America, Mexicans tend to look down on Cubans, and Costa Ricans tend to look down on Nicaraguans, and in Ecuador, the white European Spanish descendants look down on the indigenous Quechua, and my friends, religious fundamentalists don't often get to be heroes of stories that are told from this pulpit, do they? Yes, yes, yes. A lot of us have been victimized by fundamentalists, evangelicals, magical thinking Catholics, and crazy Pentecostals. But right now, I'm not talking about who they are. I'm talking about who you want to be. Who do we want to be? If you got George Zimmerman alone in a safe place and asked him about his history with young black men, he may even be able to convince you that he had plausible reason for his prejudice. I'm saying he might. For some of us, you have to suspend reality for just a moment. But even if he had plausible reason, he also had a choice to do something about the problem, like volunteer to mentor a kid in foster care, or be the reading buddy at a local elementary school. He didn't have to put a gun in his belt and go out roaming the neighborhood at night. I'm not telling you that there is no reason to be afraid, that there is no reason to ever be prejudiced, or that I have no sympathy for those who are tired of being victimized by crime. I'm just telling you now, here in the clear, bright light of a sunny Sunday morning, to decide who you want to be. Do you want revenge, or do you want to become the kind of person that has the nobility of spirit to be forgiving? Do you want to feel safe and empowered and aggressive? Or do you want to choose to be vulnerable enough to love your enemy and to show kindness even to someone who doesn't deserve it? Jesus told a story about a man who chose to be bigger than his fear, bigger than his anger, bigger than his sense of having been victimized or his need for safety or revenge. Now, it was just a story. However, you are not just a story. You are real. And you live in a society where real choices have to be made. Don't presume that I'm neutral here. Neutrality is the job of almost every other preacher you're ever going to meet. I'm here to tell you that I believe that the Good Samaritan made a good choice and that George Zimmerman made a bad choice. I want you to make the right choice. And until it's safe to walk while being black in America, all of us need to keep exposing the hypocrisy of the nation that we live in and have helped to create. Amen.
You've been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at reverenddray@aol.com for more information.